This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh as we turn right now to the initiatives. There were several key votes related to the regulation of marijuana. In Maine, residents of Portland approved a measure that would legalize small amounts of marijuana possession. Voters in Colorado approved a measure to tax recreational marijuana, apply the first $40 million in revenue generated by the tax to school funding. Residents in Denver, Boulder, and Littleton, Colorado also passed municipal referenda to impose additional sales taxes on marijuana at the city level. And here in New York, Kenneth Thompson beat longtime Brooklyn DA Charles Hines in a landslide election. Thompson has promised to move to decriminalize possession of marijuana by refusing to bring criminal cases against people arrested with small amounts of the drug. John Nichols of The Nation and author of Dollarocracy, the significance of these pot measures across the country.
Well, I think it's one of the wonderful things about democracy, when you actually give people a chance to vote on some of the issues which we're told so often in our media are still controversial and divisive. They're not. The fact of the matter is that in Portland, Maine, and I was up there, I actually talked to folks who were doing this thing. They didn't have a lot of money. They didn't have some sort of big, multi-million-dollar campaign. These were grassroots folks who, had tried to do a statewide law and had not gotten all the progress they'd wanted statewide. So they put this thing on the ballot in Portland. They won 67% of the vote. It was a landslide. And the fact of the matter is that in places across this country, when you say to voters, look, we want to either decriminalize or legalize marijuana, the response of voters is, yeah, it's time. It's much like the marriage equality issue. It took the political class and the media class a long time to catch up with the reality that the arc of history had, in fact, bent toward justice. On marijuana, you have a remarkable combination of factors. One is a lot of people who just don't think it's as scary a thing as they've been told. But the other thing is, and I think this is especially true in Kenneth Thompson's victory in Brooklyn, he associated it with issues like stop and frisk and a lot of other concerns, that young people who were busted with a small amount of marijuana ended up being thrown into a legal system. And in fact, there weren't that many full prosecutions, but it's just the idea that you were getting hit by that. And so what he said is, look, we're just not going to prosecute these. That is a signal to the police. It's a signal to the whole structure that let's stand down in this area. Let's stop using this perhaps as an excuse to hassle folks, and let's look at real crimes, at more serious crimes. I think that combination of factors, one, people who actually think this isn't as big a deal, and two, folks who think that this has really become a part of policing that we ought to be concerned about and ought to address, has created some very significant patterns of results across the country.
So what do you think, John, how does this relate, the results, what do they reflect about the changes in the national conversation politically on some of these crucial issues?
Well, I hope that the fracking referendums from Colorado will kind of feed up the political food chain. I'm not sure it will. The fact of the matter is...
talk about this.
Well, we all know what fracking is. It's where you're kind of beating up the ground in order to kind of soften it up to get fuel resources out of it. And what you had in Colorado was some citizen referendums, some referendums on the ballot where people were given right to say, look, we don't want this here.
At least 3 of 4
yes,
banned fracking.
Yeah.
And then in Ohio, 1 of 3 banned fracking.
And at the grassroots across this country, this is a huge movement. I mean, there are people all over this country, and this is, I want to emphasize, conservatives, liberals, Democrats, Republicans, when you got this in your neighborhood, you're concerned and you want to address it. And when people are given a right to vote on this, to weigh in, there's a lot of evidence that they really object. That's the kind of thing that ought to, again, feed up the political food chain. It ought to go to the legislatures. It ought to go to Congress. President Obama and others ought to hear this and recognize that as they advance energy policies, this notion that fracking should be a big part of our future energy policy in this country ought to be rethought. The people are saying that from the grassroots. There's so many things that the people try to say and try to get through this money and media election complex that is so hard to break through. And I think that today or yesterday what you saw was people are trying to say, we really want some different policies on the drug war. We would really like some different environmental and energy policies. That's coming up there. They clearly, I think there's no question, they said we want a different approach to austerity. Instead of cuts, we'd like to do different tax policies and actually look at raising the wage floor, things of that that nature. And my concern always is that so much of our media doesn't carry those messages up. And in fact, we sort of put a wall on these local referendums. And that's why I'm so glad we're talking today, because this is what we ought to do. We ought to look at elections as individual local events across this country, but we should also look for those patterns, those messages that come out. And I frankly think that Tuesday's election sent quite a few important messages.
Well, John Nichols, we want to thank you very much for being with us. John Nichols is a political writer for The Nation. His new article is An Election About GOP Extremism, Unions, Wages, and Dollarocracy. And before we go, one last question about Alabama.
Yes. Huge battle in Alabama in a Republican primary between the Chamber of Commerce and the Tea Party. This is a play out of the shutdown. And it looks like the money power won. The Chamber of Commerce moved a lot of money into a district to try and nominate a guy who was a slightly more moderate conservative over a guy who is a very, very extreme right-wing candidate. And so you saw money prevail down there, it looks like, a money advantage. But we should also be conscious of the fact that this is really the beginning of a huge fight for 2014 for the soul of the Republican Party.
Well, thanks, John. Also, congratulations on the 10th anniversary of Free Press.
Thank you so much.
John Nichols, his book is called Dollarocracy. He wrote it with Bob McChesney, How the Money and Media Election Complex is Destroying America. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report.